Hello, this is Rick Harnish. I'm the Executive Director of the High Speed Rail Alliance. Thank you very much for joining us today. We've got an excellent presentation from Anthony Perl on what it took to get two institutions to work together to connect high-speed rail and airports, something that we've talked about for a long time here in this country. First, I want to give a quick overview of who the Alliance is. And what we're about and what's going on at the federal level. Let me go back to the presentation. So the Alliance is a nonprofit, 501c3. We are supported primarily by contributions from individuals like you all. And we strive to be the most knowledgeable independent source on what high-speed rail is, why we need to build it, and what steps local leaders can take, and of course in state governments, to make it happen. And then we provide the tools that people need and local leaders need in order to educate their leaders in state capitals and in Washington, D.C. We believe in what we call the integrated network approach, which combines varieties of types of railroad infrastructure. Trains are very flexible in the way you can assemble different pieces to do different things depending on what your needs are. But to simplify the discussion, we've narrowed it down to high-speed lines, where you're building new electrified tracks with no grade crossings for trains going 186 miles an hour and above. Regional lines, where you're focused on passenger trains. There might be some freight, but it's typically rebuilding existing lines. Shared use, where you're sharing with heavy freight service, and then bus lines, and they all work together to connect regions, big cities to big cities, and small towns to big cities and to each other in various different ways, again, depending upon what the local markets are and what the existing assets are. We're in the midst right now of a really exciting time. Legislation is moving in DC very quickly on 4 tracks. There's a major announcement yesterday where 21 senators and the president came to an agreement on what an infrastructure bill would look like. We're very happy that there's a big chunk of money in there for Amtrak. There's a big chunk of money for state of good repair, and another little bit for a program called CRISI, which any railroad infrastructure can be used, and you can use it for any railroad infrastructure. What's missing from that discussion is money for the high-speed and intercity passenger rail fund, which last had money in it in 2010. We're hoping that we can persuade the senators to agree to put money for that program in track 2, which is the budget resolution. Major decision expected on that next week. And then there's the ongoing debate over what policy looks like. That's track 3. And then track 4 is the annual appropriation, which is also underway. So it's complicated, but the short message is right now, we need to get as many messages into representatives and senators as we can. You can do that at fasttrackAmerica.com. You can also see our efforts to gain letters of support from mayors across the country at fasttrackAmerica.com. So one of the huge benefits that high-speed rail has in terms of the environmental is to reduce the number of feeder flights going into an airport. From my perspective, as a resident of Chicago, and therefore I am backstopping with my real estate taxes, a huge investment in expanding O'Hare Airport, and I want as many passengers to get to that field as possible to fly on the big profitable planes overseas so that I don't have to pay off those bonds. So we really want high-speed rail into O'Hare. So we thought it would be great to have Anthony Perl, who's done a lot of research on high-speed rail. This is his second time on a webinar where recently he talked about China. but a really interesting discussion of what it took to get SNCF and the Airport Authority to cooperate to build a high-speed train station at Charles de Gaulle Airport. So Anthony, thank you for joining us, and go ahead and take it away.
Thanks a lot, Rick. It's a pleasure to be back here again in this webinar, especially because it involves work that I thought had long been forgotten and ignored over my career. Back in the 1990s, I was fortunate enough to spend a year on an academic fellowship in France in 1994, as it happened, the year that Charles de Gaulle got its high-speed rail connection. So it was on my mind and on the agenda, and I'm really excited that Rick wanted to talk about it with you all today. I hope you can see my full screen now, and I just have to find the advance, unfortunately. There we go. I tell my students that writing academic articles is a bit like putting messages in bottles and throwing them into the ocean. Maybe other academics have come up with better ways to promote and publicize their work, and I'm behind on that front. But basically, once I publish something, I leave it to the fates to get that information out around the world. And if people are interested in it, I figure they will read it or engage with it in one way or another. And just like messages in bottles, a lot of times you don't know the course or the audience that your research will reach. And in this case, as I said, was very pleasantly surprised that without any prompting, Rick Harnish found this piece of work and actually was interested in it. And I can see why, living under the flight paths for one of North America's biggest airports, O'Hare, and also someone who understands the power and potential of passenger rail to transform places and mobility, that Rick would be interested in this. So I hope you will be too, and I hope I'll be able to reach back 20 plus years in my career and draw upon the happy memories that I had when I spent time at the Laboratoire d'économie de transport in Lyon, and would ride the TGV up to Paris to do research on this particular project. So Charles de Gaulle Airport is France's major global gateway, and it's also unique in Europe in the sense that it is not a physically constrained airport site. Frankfurt, Amsterdam, London, Heathrow, these are places that are fully built up around. I believe in Amsterdam, they're talking about building a runway out into the ocean or the North Sea to expand the airport there, because that's the only place they've got to put it. That's not the case with Charles de Gaulle and Roissy, as it's known, the community. The French, in their sort of typical administrative style, went in and bought up through eminent domain many, many more hectares or acres of land than they initially needed in the 1970s, so that they could have all the room possible to develop a platform, as they called it, for global aviation connectivity. They envisioned it as one of the world's super hubs, with, of course, Air France triumphantly connecting the world and bringing people to and through this great space that they'd created, which was originally planned to have up to 5 runways, many of which were going to carry supersonic aircraft, which actually happened. The Concorde served Charles de Gaulle, but this was an airport that was designed to be big enough and distant enough from other places that you could even have in theory, the kinds of space planes that Richard Branson is now pioneering to take off and land and blast across the planet and maybe beyond. That was the kind of scale that Charles de Gaulle was built for. But it was built and designed as an piece of aviation infrastructure, and it was assigned to an organization, as we'll see, that had aviation infrastructure support as its sole mission, the Aéroport de Paris. But size was one of Charles de Gaulle's great assets at the time, and as we'll see, the value of that asset evolved along with aviation, transportation, and Europeanization, shall we say, of things since the 1970s when this started. Now, as Charles de Gaulle Airport, as monumental as it was as a piece of aviation infrastructure, it was not a particularly effective node in a transportation network, except as a place to connect between planes. If you weren't actually going to Paris or France, for that matter, Charles de Gaulle was great. You could fly in from one continent and fly out to another continent and take the Concorde when it was running, and that part worked great. But the connections to the surrounding region of Paris and the rest of France were rather poor. I haven't checked it recently, but at the time, in the 1980s and 90s, autoroute A1, which is the main motorway that serves Charles de Gaulle, was the busiest road infrastructure in France. And it was busy not because everyone wanted to get to the airport necessarily. It was busy because it connected Paris with the north of France, places like Lille and other cities, as well as Belgium. If you wanted to go to the Benelux countries by road, you had to take A1, as well as the English Channel. And of course, 1994 was also a time when the Channel Tunnel emerged and opened up. And in addition to the trains that carried people all the way from Paris and Brussels to London, the Channel Tunnel also carried an awful lot of motor vehicles on those shuttle trains through it. And they all got there, if they were coming from the largest metropolitan region in France, on this autoroute A1. So as a result of this heavy traffic and very congested motorway, a few surprises occurred to the designers at Charles de Gaulle. One of which, and this may affect airports that you know about, again, I won't presume that it's the case, but because the autoroute, the motorway, was so crowded and susceptible as a traffic theory, the engineers can explain this better in the crowd, but transportation analysis shows that once you get to a certain level of motor vehicle volume, it doesn't take much to disrupt the flow of vehicles. All it takes is one flat tire or vehicle that has an engine fan belt that flies off or something, and everything grinds to a halt because it's bumper to bumper, and trying to extricate a vehicle that's in distress from crowded traffic doesn't work very well. As a result, and that would happen regularly, but unpredictably, of course. You never know when someone's fan belt is going to break or their tire is going to deflate. But that's enough, that unpredictability, to take what should be a short trip from Paris to the airport, and what is a short trip when the road is moving freely, but unpredictably, to take that trip and require people to build in a much longer cushion of time to get there. So most of the time they get to the airport early, because if you had a 20-minute drive, but you budgeted an hour just in case there was congestion and an accident or something like that, you have 40 extra minutes to be at the airport. And most people don't just sit in the parking lot or go for a walk around the outside of the building. They go and check in for their flights and spend more time in the terminal, which until recently, when airports got into the commercial shopping mall business and tried to make their terminals more and more places to spend money and shop. That wasn't the case in the 1970s and 80s very much. Created terminal overcrowding at Charles de Gaulle because they had this unreliable ground access by road. They had people coming earlier than they had expected, spending more time in the airport, which meant that their terminals got more crowded, and all of the facilities and the calculations they'd made as to how many, restrooms and how many seats they needed to have were all undersized because people couldn't get to the airport reliably and spent more time there. It was a lose-lose situation, at least until later when they figured out ways to extract money from their passengers in the terminal. But in the 1980s, that was not on the agenda, and the airport was seen somewhat, it was described, the phrase that stuck to me over the years when I was interviewing people, someone said, Charles de Gaulle Airport is like a ship in a bottle. It's this beautiful piece of infrastructure that's been constructed, but there's only one way to get there, by motor vehicle, and it's got a narrow neck that you have to get through. That was the way that most people got to the airport, was by taxi or car. But there was public transportation option. In fact, they tried to make a big deal of it at the beginning in the sort of 1970s. They had something called Roissy Rail. I'm not pronouncing it very well. It's been a while since I've been speaking French on a daily basis. But it was an example, I think, of the old style of siloed transportation planning and operations that existed in most airports in most parts of the world at the time. So they weren't particularly behind the curve, but they certainly weren't ahead of the curve. You can see from this poster in the upper left corner that the railroad on the left, SNCF, we'll talk about them, and Aéroport de Paris, that's their logo in the lower right corner, had cooperated at least enough to make this poster and set up this train. And it says a link between train and bus, 30 minutes, all inclusive, between Paris and Roissy. I remember using that service several times in the early 1980s when I first went to France, and it was not 30 minutes. So that was maybe from the time the door closed on the train at Gare du Nord in Paris to when it opened at the airport rail station, which was not connected to any of the terminals, at which point you then had to hump your bags and lug them onto a shuttle bus. And depending which terminal you were going to and how much traffic congestion there was on the internal airport access roads, which again were under-designed because so many people tried to get to the airport earlier that there were more vehicles than they expected to come at certain times. And just like the terminals, people were crowding the curb space at the airports. That could add another 15 minutes to your trip. And not surprisingly, the Charles de Gaulle Airport had one of the lowest rates of rail to air access of any major European airport in the 1980s when this operation was launched. Unfortunately, it was basically used by airport workers, a few college student backpackers like me, and people who were interested in experiencing the French intermodal operations, and that was it. Anyone who was actually a tourist, let alone a business traveler, did not see this as a viable option, sort of a 2 to 3 seat ride, depending on where you were going. If you weren't staying near Gare du Nord in Paris, you then had to connect again at the other end, of course. That was just not appealing. And as a result, the usage of this connection disappointed both the railroad and the airport operator. But when we think about it, it's not surprising that that was the case. And after low ridership for years, this Roissy Rail, the name might have continued, but the service just became an extension of the regional express network of commuter trains in Paris, Line B, it was called, a branch of Line B. I couldn't find a pre-1994 map of Line B, at least on the internet. This is the current layout where you can see there on the left corner, the lower branch, there are two stations at Charles de Gaulle. That's a post TGV interconnection map. Originally, it just stopped at where it says Airport Charles de Gaulle 1 on the map. That was what was going on before the TGV arrived. And again, you had to take the shuttle bus. But on top of that, the one advantage perhaps that Roissy Rail had before it was just a regular commuter train was that it was not particularly crowded. There weren't that many people, as I mentioned, who are actually using the train as a main way to access the airport, which is why they discontinued it. So now you had to fight, especially during rush hour, for space with regular commuters who were trying to get to places in the northern suburbs of Paris. And these trains were, of course, designed for commuting. This was what you faced, except that there were lots of people competing for those seats. No luggage space, not a particularly luggage-friendly configuration. And if you tried to get to the airport at certain times of the day or get from the airport at certain times of the day, it was a real struggle to use this service as an intercity or international traveler. As a result, France wound up with a pretty effective national airline. Air France has been doing its thing in many ways, leading certain technical and operational aspects of civil aviation for decades. And of course, the SNCF was a well-respected and effective national passenger and freight railway at the time. But the connection between these two fairly effective organizations was very weak. And I would say that France was definitely a laggard in its ability to develop air rail intermodalism until the late 1980s, when things started to change. It takes time, of course, to inaugurate new plans and infrastructure that grows out of them, to realize them. But by 1994, there was the breakthrough or leapfrog moment where Charles de Gaulle became the first major international airport to be directly connected to a high-speed rail network. And here you see an external view of the TGV station with a hotel built over it as well at Charles de Gaulle Airport. That's what was inaugurated in '94. I wasn't at the inauguration, but I did use the station from its first months of operation. And as I said, that led me to wonder how the French managed to do this maneuver to go from the back of the pack with a very low effectiveness of intermodal connectivity to the leading one at the time in Europe. And that led me to want to try and understand the organizational and administrative innovations that happened at two very well-established and respected for their own domains public enterprises. Aéroports de Paris, which I've mentioned already, was the agency responsible for running the infrastructure at Charles de Gaulle, as well as Orly Airport, the second airport for Paris, and SNCF, which I'm sure you all know a lot better than Aéroports de Paris. Both of these organizations had to change the ways that they did business. And the research that took me to understand that process and transformation led me to start to discover what I think bigger thinkers than me have come up with as the main sort of external forces that have been reshaping the world since the 1980s: greater global economic competition and political and regulatory restructuring that happened within nations. So this is a product of the globalization and deregulation of the sort of late 20th century era that changed and drove these organizations, which were not otherwise inclined to work too closely together, to find new ways to cooperate and to create mutual gains, mutually beneficial gains for each other. The starting points for SNCF, this isn't time or place for me to go into the history of French railway development, which I'd actually looked at for my PhD dissertation, but it was an early form of public-private partnership, different from the way that Germany or the UK or Belgium or other European early rail developers operated. Belgium was a purely public, for example, a purely public rail development. They were owned by the state. It was run as a department of government. The UK was, of course, private. France was somewhere in the middle. It was an early adopter, if you want to call it that, of public-private partnership. In the 19th century, that public-private partnership came from a very interesting set of concessions, franchises, you might call them in today's language, that the government awarded to different private companies on a monopoly basis. The French made an interesting distinction, which I think could be useful for high-speed rail development in North America, perhaps, maybe adapted. They made a distinction between what they called the infrastructure and the superstructure. The infrastructure was everything below the rail, the right-of-way, the subgrade, all of the ballast and drainage and all of the things that were needed to put the tracks up and in place. And those stayed public. The national government in France, through their elite engineering corps, the Corps de Pont et Chaussée, were the ones who built the infrastructure, as they called it. And for them, the infrastructure stopped at the rail bed. And once you put the tracks and the signals and later the electrification on top, that was called the superstructure. And those were the responsibility of the operating concession or franchise holders. And they raised private money to pay for that part of the transportation. And of course, the operations they were responsible for on a I can't remember whether it was 99 years. I think it was 99-year franchise for most of them. And that got the French railways up and running for the 19th and early 20th centuries. But of course, economic crisis emerged in the 1930s. And at that point, the private franchise owners of these different concessions, all of which were on a radial basis, pointing in different directions from Paris, north, south, east, west, southwest. There were 5 of them. During the Depression, these companies were insolvent, but at that point, rail was still the major mode of intercity and even regional transportation in France. Air and road were not really significant by that point, growing, but not significant. So in a sense, the railways were too big to fail at that point. And that's when the French government sort of went into an additional layer of public-private partnership on top of the tradition they'd already started. Of course, they owned the infrastructure under the rails, and they took over 51% of the ownership of everything else through a mixed enterprise. Something that most people don't remember is that SNCF was not a public, 100% public railway from the beginning. It was created in 1938, and for the first 50 years, it was a mixed enterprise, with the private investors having guaranteed sort of preferred shares that paid off their debts, their assets that they had given to the state. They didn't get any money right away, or not a big amount in 1938, but they got a guarantee that they would get paid steadily from 1938 to 1958. And that's what happened. The French railways were actually 49% privately owned until 1988. And it was only after that that the state became 100% owner. But you can see in this poster from that 1930s era, the image that was trying to be created. Governments are always concerned about their image, and the sense was exactitude, which is precision. The state railway, État, is there, and they were trying to show that, you know, government's responsibility taking over these insolvent railways would lead to great results, which actually happened on many levels along the way. But the underlying principle behind this consolidation of the separate franchises was a natural monopoly, that the railways had gotten into trouble because of global economic turbulence, but that they had to be preserved and integrated with into a single network, which would provide the natural way of getting freight and people around the French nation. And that was pretty much the organizational culture that SNCF had from its origins. There's some dark days during the 1940s when France was occupied, which I didn't really go into, but there's some real moments there where some bad things happened. But otherwise, it was a natural monopoly designed to serve the economic and social needs and potential of France. Meanwhile, Aéroport de Paris was created around the same time through the logic of industrial promotion. Aviation, civil aviation in Europe in the immediate pre-war and certainly in the first few decades after the Second World War was seen as an infant industry, as something that that had lots of benefits, technical, social, economic benefits, but that needed protection because it was not a stable or self-sufficient commercial venture. So post-war aviation in Europe, as in many other parts of the world, including North America, was very highly regulated, not just by safety terms, which continue to this day, fortunately, and one of the reasons why civil aviation is such a safe mode of transportation, but also in terms of routes and services and fares. All of that was regulated. And in Europe, what that translated into, for the most part, which was the most significant factor in airport planning, was flag carriers, Air France, British Airways, Lufthansa, other companies, Swiss Air. These were airlines that were owned by the governments, either entirely or majority stakeholder. And the way that regulatory rules worked was that basically between city pairs in Europe, the regulators would allow one carrier from each country that had a bilateral treaty to operate service. So let's say between Paris and Frankfurt in Germany, there would be slots and service quota for Air France and an equal number of slots and flights frequencies regulated and allowed for Lufthansa. And in practice, most of these services then were operated as pooled duopolies. In other words, Air France and Lufthansa had interchangeable tickets. You could book on one and switch to another without much cost, if any. The cost was up front because these were very high regulated fares. And the companies would simply pool the revenue that all of their services together generated between Paris and Frankfurt. This led to very predictable, very consistent types of operations. It was very easy to plan how much capacity, terminals, and runways would be needed when you knew that Air France and Lufthansa would each operate 4 or 5 flights a day between Paris and Frankfurt, and that's all you had to know. So it made it pretty straightforward for companies like Aéroport de Paris and other airport operators in Europe to provide the infrastructure that was needed. And the logic or the goal was to provide that at a fairly low cost, that supporting the infant industry and development of aviation, civil aviation in Europe and in other countries was seen to depend on not burdening these air carriers like Air France with lots of fees and expensive infrastructure. And when it came to other modes and costs and benefits of dealing with them, rail was still regarded as a competitor in European intercity travel before the 1980s. I guess up through the 1970s, certainly major intercity routes on the continent of Europe had a trans-European express service network. And although they weren't high-speed trains, they were certainly higher speed, pretty close to what the Northeast Corridor type services now operate, so that you could get between Paris and Brussels by higher speed trans-Europe express trains in about 3 hours. Of course, now it's less than half of that time, or about half of that time. And so the airports and the air carriers were very wary of working too closely with railroads because they were still seen as rivals and competitors. And that was even before high-speed rail began. So you had these organizations that were in their silos with their logic and way of doing business, which worked fairly well for a stable environment that had been created in the post-war decades in Europe. But of course, that made it not that easy for these organizations to connect gaps, especially intermodal gaps between rail and air. The interesting innovation, maybe there's more research to be done on it, but when you think about it, the places that had the early breakthroughs in terms of filling those gaps were not the leading airports or leading transportation innovators in Europe. Brussels Airport was the first one to have an in-terminal rail connection, followed, I believe, by Zurich in Switzerland, and then Frankfurt. I may be missing a few others, but the smaller ones were the innovators. Just like in evolution, it's the little smaller creatures scurrying about beneath the dinosaurs that wind up adapting and innovating and having the breakthroughs that are later picked up by the surviving dinosaurs. And in this case, it was the gap between SNCF and Air France that was quite apparent, by 1980. So as I mentioned, these global forces created a new balance or balancing act, maybe, across European boundaries. And that triggered the search for a new way to do business between modes within France. And on the rail side, something that I think is somewhat underappreciated, at least in North America, maybe because we haven't reached that sort of critical threshold, tipping point, whatever you want to call it, is that high-speed rail as a technical and organizational breakthrough and advance really changed expectations, both in the general population and in government, about what passenger railroads were capable of doing. The economic opportunity that the TGV between Paris and Lyon, there's the original one. I don't know if that's the absolute original train set, but that's certainly the first generation of SNCF TGV. And something that I think is underappreciated is that once that breakthrough occurred, people in positions of power and even people on the street sort of looked at SNCF differently. It was no longer an organization that had to be subsidized and protected to provide essential services at a loss that were still socially beneficial. It was now an organization that could actually win and make money and create profitable but also effective intercity transportation. Someday, I hope we're going to see that effect in North America with our passenger railways, because what that did was send clear signals to the management and the leaders of these organizations that they had to up their game. If they could do it between Paris and Lyon, they had to start thinking along the same lines as to making that combination of economic, social, and environmental success work across their network. And that is what sort of started the wheels turning in terms of people's expectations about passenger rail and what it could do in France and in other countries in Europe as well. And I hope someday we'll get there as well. There was some competition going on soon after the French high-speed rail breakthrough. The Germans were following with their ICE trains, and the Italians were working on their own technology. And in this sort of more ambitious and competitive environment, there was a sense that there was going to be eventually a European high-speed rail network, which we now see much further along decades later. The European Union calls it the TEN, I believe, the Trans-European Network of High-Speed Rail. But just like air and even highway networks, there were going to be hubs and centers of gravity in that. And in this case, there would also be technology effects in both France and Germany, and Italy too, for that matter, and Spain. In fact, there were manufacturers and engineering approaches to high-speed rail that were similar but distinctive enough that some could outcompete the other in terms of future opportunities, future sales, and not just within Europe, but even exporting beyond that. So that added another dimension of opportunity and competition in this growing evolution of what was possible and what should be considered viable and desirable for railroads in Europe once the high-speed rail revolution had begun. Germany had a bit of a leg up initially in terms of network connectivity, in terms of its rail, high-speed rail and other parts of its transportation network, because the German rail, except for, of course, the Iron Curtain, but that came down a little later. But the German rail network was more distributed in terms of networks and connectivity, as opposed to a single big central hub like Paris. But remember, those rail franchises that had been given out in the 19th century were quite profitable in and of themselves at that time. And the idea of these companies cooperating and integrating with one another was not seen as necessary or desirable at the time. And that resulted in each of these major French predecessor companies to SNCF building their own palatial, beautiful rail terminals in central Paris. Here you have Gare du Nord, Gare de Lyon, Gare de l'Est, Gare d'Austerlitz. There were a few others as well. Some of them made it into impressionist paintings. I should have put the famous Monet one about the Gare Saint-Lazare in there. Beautiful buildings, perfectly suited to getting people from one part of France to or from Paris. And that was it. They were not really conducive to a network. And people at SNCF quickly realized that once you got up to a European scale of high-speed rail travel and opportunity, that these stations, wonderful as they are and used as they were for the people who were going to and from central Paris, were not enough. So there was a need for SNCF to look beyond its hub and spoke individual terminus, multiple terminal connections in Paris. And the first part of that was to connect the growing high-speed rail infrastructure north of Paris, which went up to the English Channel and eventually into Belgium, with the southern network that was the original TGV that came down to Lyon. The idea was to build a belt bypass for Paris, rather than try the monumental expense of digging tunnels and interconnections through the center of the city and trying to create brand new stations like happened in Berlin, for example. Once the wall came down, there's a great, very expensive train station in the German capital that connects up the eastern and western networks there, and really is a single focus for intercity rail in Berlin. The French, earlier than that, thought, no, let's just look to the suburbs for several reasons. One reason is that the central Paris was not going to be the biggest growth area for users of high-speed rail. The people there would all use it, of course, but there was a need to encourage other people who didn't live within walking distance or a short metro ride of one of the central terminals to use high-speed rail. And if you lived in the suburbs, which were growing in the 1980s in Europe too, in slightly different ways than the American suburban sprawl, but still suburbs were growing, more people were living there. And what was clear to rail and transportation planners in France was that if you lived in a suburb like Marne-la-Vallée, which is to the east of Paris, you were not going to ride one of those commuter trains for 45 minutes into Paris to get on a train that would then go back out again through the suburbs to go north or south or even other directions, west perhaps. That was just not going to happen. So suburban stations were really important and recognized early on, not just in Paris, but certainly in the Parisian area. They were also cheaper to turn into connecting hubs. The land was cheaper. Usually the planning, they weren't landmarks in the way that the Gare de Lyon or Gare du Nord were, historically significant buildings that couldn't be messed with and rebuilt very quickly. These suburban stations, which are like Metro Park on the Northeast Corridor, those types of facilities could be quickly adapted to serve as both suburban gateways to high-speed rail and interconnection points where people could change from one line to another much more easily than trying to do something in central Paris. So when SNCF's planners were thinking about this new suburban strategy in the late 1980s, they thought, well, one of the places that makes sense if we're going to have a northern suburban connection point in Paris for our high-speed trains, why not think about the airport at Charles de Gaulle? So they started identifying that at an early stage. I think it took a little bit longer for the airport planners to start to see the potential, but they did because the European civil aviation network was becoming liberalized, and that led to two patterns of accelerating growth that led to different models of airport planning. First, on the right there is the mega hub strategy, which was sort of taken even further than it had been under the regulated system. Airports like London, like Frankfurt, just kept growing in terms of the number of connections that their global lead airline like Lufthansa or British Airways could do. And there was a sense that France needed that too. And Charles de Gaulle was the natural mega hub for that. But there was also the beginnings of the sort of Southwest airline strategy with companies like Ryanair and EasyJet and these low-cost carriers that didn't want to be at a big hub airport. They wanted to do point-to-point service, usually from smaller, cheaper to access and cheaper to operate at airports where they could quickly arrive and depart. And that was a competitive threat to Aéroport de Paris before deregulation and the liberalization of these low-cost carriers. You could pretty much count on the population and the economic growth of Paris to keep filling planes and slots and terminals at Aéroport de Paris facilities. But all of a sudden, other airports beyond the control of this one public organization were taking passengers and business away from Paris. People were willing to drive an hour or maybe ride a bus, single seat ride up to an airport outside of the metropolitan area. So Aéroport de Paris also felt some pressures to figure out what do we do to meet both the global mega hub potential that we're well suited for and fend off some of the competition from these low-cost point-to-point operators who don't want to be in our facilities and would take business, potential business to other places. Aéroport de Paris realized that they were in greater competition than before with places like London, Amsterdam, and Frankfurt. These are the mega hubs in terms of passengers that they were nearby. And they looked to Frankfurt particularly and Amsterdam as places they had to catch up with or maybe even leapfrog in terms of their advantages and benefits to becoming a global mega hub. And they started to see, with the partial exception of London, that intermodal connectivity was a key ingredient of the success of these other mega hub airports. So they recognized at that point that they were behind the curve on that. Why were mega hubs and intermodalism synergistic to each other? Well, here's a picture of Frankfurt Airport. You can see the land, even though it's a more constrained airport, and they've been figuring out where to squeeze more runways in by buying plots of land in different places. What you see in the foreground is the airport city that they are building, satellite city with hotels, offices, and other synergistic meeting rooms and event spaces, which go with the global mega hub, where people, some people, will want to be located quite close to the airport, either permanently or on a short-term basis, to have events and gatherings where people fly in from different countries, maybe even different continents, meet up for a day or two, and then go their separate ways again. And so these spaces generate lots of revenue, or can, as real estate joint ventures of various kinds. And that gives the airport more revenue to work on building out its aviation infrastructure at lower cost to the airline operators that use the facility. So that was a formula that other global mega airports in Europe were using. And one of the ways you build the value and the rents or profits that you can collect from this kind of development is increasing not just the global accessibility, but the regional and national accessibility of these spaces. And having a good intercity rail connection point at your airport, which Frankfurt and Amsterdam did, certainly generated value that could be captured. Just like in the 19th century in Europe and North America, for that matter, railroads figured it out the first time, value capture, get the land, build the infrastructure, get the mobility going, and then collect the profits from either selling or developing that land. That was part of the formula. And remember, Aéroport de Paris at Charles de Gaulle had the single largest amount of land available for any major airport in Europe. All of a sudden, that land that could have filled 5 runways and maybe lots of parking lots started to look a lot more valuable for other forms of use, more complex but multi-dimensional synergistic type of use, like these airport satellite cities, which the French called aéroville. Here, this is a fast forward to a recent photo. This is a shopping center that's been built adjacent to Charles de Gaulle Airport. I don't know whether it is on airport land or adjacent to airport land, but the model was it was a joint development with Aéroport de Paris. So they got a stake in this, and they have others. As you remember that picture I showed earlier of the TGV station, there was a hotel built right on top of it. So they were thinking ahead to see how they could monetize the access of their land assets. And one of the key ingredients to make that work is to have regional and intercity rail access. There's not too many people who will fly from another country to go to a shopping mall, but there are people around Paris metropolitan area who will take good rail access to go to places like that. So there was clear evidence that these organizations, for different reasons, were feeling both the heat and the attraction or potential of doing things differently and creating infrastructure that would enable this intermodal synergy to create benefits for both of them. It was new thinking, it was different organizational behavior, and it required a midwife of sorts, or an honest broker, some third party that could help bring these organizations to a new place in terms of working together. And neither of them had what they needed to be able to do this on their own for themselves. So the key to unlocking the silos, if you will, or the sort of past organizational structures that had constrained or inhibited this type of planning and collaboration, was something, a third layer, if you will, that was created. And that's something to think about maybe in the US and other contexts as well, whether that's universal or whether it's just the way it worked in France. What happened in France, among other things, in the 1980s is that the Mitterrand government brought in a new law for decentralizing regional social and economic development. Regions of France had been, ever since Napoleon, probably going back even to the Louis XIV era, had been run from Paris. And it had pretty much run its course by the 1980s as to how well the country could be managed centrally from the nation's capital at every level. So what was created under the famous Loi de Fer, there's Gaston de Fer, the minister in the Mitterrand government who was responsible for this very significant organizational transformation of creating regional governments. He brought this law into practice, and it was named after him. And new regional governments were created and given new powers. And for Paris, it was called the Région Île-de-France, the island of France at the center of the capital region. And that organization had not been there when Roissy was turned into Charles de Gaulle Airport, and when the railroads and Aéroport de Paris each did their own thing. So that was a new organizational space that had a mandate to do regional transportation planning, regional economic development, and regional social development planning. And that made a big difference because that organization, the Île-de-France, was the convener, if you will, of a series of expert groups that brought leaders in transportation, public administration, engineering, planning, finance together in 3 stages to collaborate and build up the learning curve to find ways to do what they wound up doing differently. So it began in 1985 when this sort of suburban interconnected rail infrastructure program of SNCF was developed. And this FUNEL Commission brought together regional representatives, different business sector representatives, railroads, and Aéroport de Paris was involved to set the terms, because their TGV interconnection route, the alignment and the right-of-way, would have to go through, or would need to go through the great amount of land that had been created for Aéroport de Paris infrastructure at Roissy. So that was the first step, to set a collaboration on just bringing the tracks into the airport space. And then the question became, well, what's going to happen once we do that? Will we build another satellite station in a dark corner of the infrastructure away from all the other activities, and then run a bus every 10 minutes for the people to connect? They'd seen pretty clearly how limiting a strategy that was with Roissy Rail. So that wasn't a top contender. So they set up a second working group. Again, they named them after the chairs, who were all men and all engineers and senior civil servants, but neutral, who weren't part of one organization or the other, to broker and facilitate the design and the terms of who would be doing what to build an intermodal station inside the next new terminal that was going to be developed, Terminal 2C, I believe it was, or 2D, or maybe it was between 2D and 2C. That's where the Rudeau Commission sort of did its work to take the plan from the level of, well, we have the infrastructure and the right-of-way alignment in place, to this is where the station will actually be integrated with the airport terminal in a way that would allow the high-speed rail to go directly in. And as well, they built an automated people mover, very similar to what's in O'Hare now, that would connect to other terminals and future developments and shopping malls and hotels and things like that, so that it was fully integrated with frequent and fairly low barrier to connection type of service. But for people who were going to Terminal 2, which was maybe not coincidentally the terminal that Air France had as its international hub, you could walk from the train to the plane. And that all came about in this collaborative design process. The last third commission that had to come together, and they did this sequentially, was once you had the right-of-way, once you had the station sketched out, how is it going to be paid for? And of course, that's always the challenge, as we see even today, as we speak in the US, the Congress and the administration are busy debating. And as Rick said, there's 4 different tracks for financing. And I know that financing is important, but if there's a lesson from this process, it's that it's a lot easier to come up with the financial deal once you have approved plans for the infrastructure and the intermodal facilities around it, so that people know what they're going to be getting for their money and their stake. And so the Abraham Commission, Charles Abraham, who I knew best of the 3 of these different leaders, I guess it had been the most recent one that had been done, closest to when I was doing my interviews in the 1994 period. So I was able to connect, not directly, but with people who had worked on that commission. Charles Abraham was the retired head of another major French public enterprise, the Compagnie Générale Maritime, which was the national ocean shipping public enterprise. France like the US, there was United States lines. They, I think, still hold the record for the fastest transatlantic crossing of a passenger ship on the SS United States. The Compagnie Générale Maritime was a public enterprise, and Abraham had run it, so he had the cred to go into meetings with the head of other major public enterprises like the railroad and the airport. He'd been there and done that, but he was in marine transportation, so he wasn't seen as an aviation partisan or a railroad partisan. He could be a neutral broker. Think about who those sorts of people would be in the future of developing these kinds of facilities in other places. And if you can find them and engage them, they could maybe make a big difference in coming up with what now looks like a simple compromise, a sort of a 45% equal split in terms of paying for and running this infrastructure between the airport and the railroad. And the sort of secret sauce was the 10% that the regional government put in to through its economic development mandate to say, yes, this is going to, that Aéroville shopping center is an example of how the economic development generates benefits and opportunities for the region. Presumably tax revenue comes back over time to help offset the cost, and that justifies this local match of 10%. That's what it took to put the pieces of the puzzle together. And it, along the way, gave these organizations that had not previously figured out a way to work together effectively a chance to develop trust and appreciation of what each one had to offer, and that if they put it together, they could actually come out with better results. So here we are, and that's when I finished the article. There's a little bit more, maybe just a tiny bit to add before I wrap up. The infrastructure that was built was actually even more intermodal than is currently in use today. The French like to be comprehensive in their plans and infrastructure engineering, and they built in a set of baggage transfer tunnels and infrastructure that connects the TGV station to the airport terminals, at least Terminal 2, which would still allow through baggage from air to rail, where you could pick it up or check it in at a rail station somewhere else in way beyond Paris, and not see it again till your flight lands in North America or Asia or some other place far away, or vice versa. Those facilities were maybe used for test purposes for a while in the 1990s. Then, unfortunately, for many reasons, 9/11 came up, and that pretty much put on hold the idea of intermodal baggage facilities for a while in many places. Some have figured out ways to make it secure and continue doing it, but that hasn't yet, to my knowledge, to occur at Charles de Gaulle Airport. So there's even more potential for integration. SNCF and Air France and even some other operators have put together joint services, joint fares, through tickets, integrated schedules, so that, for example, Air France no longer operates between Paris and Brussels. Any connections that people make to Belgium with Air France have a rail link that goes to Charles de Gaulle, and then a direct connection to the air service, to or from the air service. So there's been some further integration. In the article, I raised the question as to whether there would be the sort of full intermodal unification that you see in some other airports, and that has still to happen. But the potential and the infrastructure certainly is there at Charles de Gaulle to make that happen. So what are some lessons for US infrastructure redevelopment in the event that these many billions really do start flowing at long last to modernize and upgrade American, dare I hope someday Canadian infrastructure, transportation infrastructure to the 21st century. I think there are some lessons, and I know that we're obsessed with money because it's been so scarce for so many decades, and it's definitely essential. But I think that the lesson from Charles de Gaulle shows that money was not sufficient for the redevelopment and the integration between air and rail. And I would say that we've also seen the role, the essential role that effective regional planning institutions can provide. May not be the only way to do it, but it certainly worked well in France to create this safe space, a neutral territory for air and rail organizations that had only had limited collaboration and limited success from that collaboration, as the Rossi Rail example showed, to discover and understand how to work together more effectively. Finally, the macro external world's changes, the greater competition between hub airports, the greater competition between rail technologies and rail carriers for the center of gravity in Europe's emerging high-speed rail network. Those can work their way through the transportation carriers and the trade sort of relationships and other networks that they think of them as a solvent that unblocks some of the sort of constraints on this kind of innovation. So that's it. Thank you. I'm looking forward to discussing this further. Thanks again.
What? I'm on mute. Sorry about that. So thank you. That was really cool. First question, kind of going backwards, just because it came up first, kind of emphasize that this is more than just connecting to the airport. This is how trains or people can get easily connected from the north to south or from the west to the south in Paris and etc. Right?
I think Paris and Chicago have something in common in the sense that there were lots of grand 19th century railroads that built palatial terminals in the city center, and you don't want to abandon or minimize their utility, but that suburban interconnections are the sort of icing on the cake to take regional intercity rail to the next level beyond that. And if you can add the airport on top of those suburban regional connections, that's, I guess, the cherry on top of the icing on top of the cake. So I think there is some parallel between Paris and Chicago that way.
And I know there's a lot of trains that run through from like Lille to the southern part of the country. And I think, you know, high-speed rail advocates frequently limit themselves to short distances, but there are trains that go from London to the south of France direct, and they run through the airport, not necessarily stopping there. So,
yeah, it's hard to imagine a Midwest high-speed rail network where everyone goes into the loop of Chicago to connect between, you know, Missouri and Michigan and that sort of thing, or Ohio and Wisconsin. It's going to have to be in the outer districts around Chicago that these facilities happen. And if you did it at a major airport infrastructure, so much the better.
Yeah, in fact, SNCF had a proposal for a Midwest network where they did that. They actually proposed building the bypass first and then coming into the city.
Right. Well, they have the experience, and I think it's not coincidental that, you know, Chicago and Paris have those similar configurations. If you want to build on, I know it's a bad pun, track record, they actually have demonstrated that they can do that, and it worked.
And then if you could clarify again the difference between infrastructure and superstructure.
Well, it's a 19th century French model that wasn't exactly picked up, but except by eccentric academics like me. But it seems to me that you could make a distinction in terms of public-private partnership, that, you know, government takes responsibility for establishing the right-of-way, acquiring the land, clearing it, putting the sort of bridges and tunnels and whatever that's needed to actually operate future services on it. And then the private partners bring the investment and the responsibility for putting in the tracks, signals, electrification, other necessary sort of structures on top of that infrastructure. So in France, that was the original model, that the government sort of delivered to whoever their partner was a cleared right-of-way, sort of like, I guess, development partnerships where, you know, they clear the land and have the lots all, you know, laid out and the sewers and roads for it, and then individuals or a group of developers comes in and builds the actual structures on top of it. That was the original model in France. It worked from about the 1860s till the 1930s. And I think there are some aspects of it that could be useful to consider for the major infrastructure developments that might lie ahead in North America.
You know, I think it's how it worked in Chicago with the subways, where the city built the subways and then the CTA put the basic infrastructure in to actually run it. Let's see here. There was another important one that I can't find it. In your opinion, you know, I expressed my opinion at the beginning that this would improve the economics of O'Hare dramatically if we could get high-speed rail into it. There might be some who fear that and that would be because we would be much more competitive for an area of about 300 miles to get people to the field to take the big planes where the profits come in. Do you share that view, or do you think, you know, there's other people that would fear that if you stop flying some of the smaller planes in, you decrease the traffic overall?
I think that rail is a volume generator and a volume business, and you need an awful lot of sort of 50-seat regional jets to equal what a train can deliver from the 300, maybe even 500-mile catchment area to the airport. I think that there's more upside than downside to that equation, and I think that especially if we add in, you know, the external impacts of climate crisis that we're starting to see, the zero carbon option of bringing in electric rail for that regional service starts to look even more appealing and attractive. So yeah, I think that in a one future model, airports like Charles de Gaulle, you know, they just canceled all the regional jets that go anywhere in France to connect people in, and even as far as Belgium, and maybe eventually it will include other Switzerland and other places. They can just keep going to decarbonize their footprint a bit. Those big international flights also have big footprints as well, but to the extent that they're still going to operate, economies of scale and volume and moving people onto low or no carbon connections make a lot of sense.
Excellent. There's a question, I want to, if I can real quick, share the current map of the high-speed network in France. So these are this is the high-speed network for France today, for the high-speed lines, not where high-speed trains run. And to answer a different question that popped up here, currently in France, the fastest line is going to the east at 205 miles an hour, And then, so the newer sections are running at 205 miles an hour. The original segment was actually from the suburbs of Lyon to this junction point here. That's the oldest section. It's only going 170. But to use this to emphasize that you've got the high-speed lines coming in from the southwest, from the southeast, from the east, and from the north, and the original terminals are in the middle of the city, and this link through or around and connecting to the airport here is the piece that now allows trains, and Ross pointed out, I was saying there are trains from London to the south coast, and that is seasonal, but that's what allows the trains to run through. But also this can be the connection point from different trains, and there's another key connection point at Lille up here. So it really becomes integral to making this work as a cross Paris or across France and across Germany, et cetera, network, as opposed to totally focused on Paris as the destination point.
Yeah, the French showed that you don't have to make it either or. It's not about city or suburban high-speed rail. It's both. Trains, as you pointed out earlier, Rick, at the beginning, are very flexible, much more than the auto industry publicity machine will put out in their propaganda. You can have suburban interconnections and intercity services that serve the city center, and they can run 5 minutes apart and just stop in different places and create a very effective network that serves a wide range of mobility needs, actually better than either road or air would by themselves, despite the propaganda.
Right. I love how the highway guys right now are talking about how you need the flexibility of cars because population moves around and businesses move around. But I'm sorry, I don't remember the last time somebody picked up a major superhighway and moved it someplace else. Let's see here. I think we've covered, I know there's a lot of comments, but I think we've covered most of the big questions.
Well, maybe I'll ask you a question, Rick, since it crossed my mind. Is there an equivalent regional government authority in the Chicagoland area that could play the role of the honest broker that the Ile-de-France region did? Because whether it's private railroads or Amtrak or some other entity that's, and of course, O'Hare, as I understand it, is a city-owned piece of airport infrastructure. There's a Chicago Department of Aviation, I think, or it used to be, that ran it. Is there a regional player that could bring these together, or should there be if there isn't?
Well, so to go through the agencies, there is the Chicago Department of Aviation that runs the airport. There's the Chicago Department of Transportation, which was kind of the honest broker, as you'd call it, for CREATE. So when the freight railroads had a problem of, the BNSF thought the top priority was the Englewood flyover, which was on Norfolk Southern, and they couldn't coordinate. So the Chicago Department of Transportation became that coordinator for freight. There's Amtrak, Metra, and to some degree the CTA and PACE, because they play a role in the interconnectivity of all of this. Cook County has emerged to some degree as kind of an external force like that, or an outside force for passenger. And right now they are financing kind of what we view as an intermediate step towards understanding how to make this work in reducing fares on 2 metro lines, and hopefully getting to the point that you can use a single ticket between Metra, CTA, and PACE, which doesn't exist today. Then we created, and also IDOT, of course, Illinois Department of Transportation plays a major role in all of this. We persuaded the state legislature to create a commission to start thinking about these issues on a much bigger picture view for the state. The governor hasn't signed the bill yet, but we're very optimistic that he will. And then at least we can have one of those temporary commissions that starts to think about these issues and figures out how we create this interconnectivity. Metra has been, Metra, the passenger rail operator for the northeast corner of the state, has as one of its priorities a direct connection from downtown Chicago into O'Hare. And we're excited that they've taken that on.
Another set of dynamics that I didn't cover in the 1998 article, but that is relevant now. I would be only a little bit more aware of it, and I think some of your partners and participants probably know more about this than I do, but it's the freight side. You know, air freight is a time-sensitive business. Obviously, people don't pay those huge premiums to put things on planes to have them stall in traffic for hours at a time trying to get in and out of the airport. And that was one of the consequences of improving the intermodal connectivity, again, deblocking that auto route A1 to allow air freight to have a chance of actually meeting its time-sensitive needs as well. And I don't know how it works at O'Hare, but I imagine that anything that could open up fluidity for air freight movements on those same roads that are filled with single occupant or taxis or Ubers now, vehicles, would be generate the value that's added from that needs to be factored in to these plans as well.
Absolutely, but you brought another question. So since I started paying attention to this issue in the 80s, everybody's talked about putting air freight on trains. The only meaningful example was the TGV Postal Service, which they did not, when it came time to retire the trains, they decided to kill the service. And China has built the first outside of another train to test that concept. I would really like a better answer on why that really hasn't taken off and what we would need to do to make sure it was included in high-speed rail in the States. I don't know if that's anything you've talked about.
No, it's I'm at the same place you are. It seems very promising, but there's got to be a way to advance that, and it should be on the agenda. I know Amtrak got into the express business a while back, and it didn't end well. So there probably are some challenges and lessons to be learned as to what not to do from that, and hopefully find what needs to be done going forward.
Absolutely, absolutely. So we've gone significantly over.
Oh, I'm sorry about that.
No, this has been great. I've been very happy. I want to connect a comment, Kirk. See, the High-Speed Rail Authority in California does not plan to blast through centers of cities at great expense. They are working with the local railroads in LA and San Francisco to do dramatic improvements to the commuter railroads in conjunction with high-speed rail on the existing rights-of-way. But thank you again, Anthony, for joining us. Really appreciate this. And we'll send out a link to everybody to the paper if you didn't see it already. And hopefully we can talk again soon.
Thanks, Rick. Great to see you again. Thank you all for joining.
Yep. Bye.
Bye-bye.